There's so much fabulous architecture in Toledo for a city its size, it's almost unbelievable. I'm planning on making 2 or maybe 3 short videos on the town's architecture, but I'll still end up leaving out some buildings of real quality. In this first video, we look at the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes, which is one of my very favourite buildings, as well as a couple of fantastic synagogues located right beside it. In the next video, we look at the cathedral. Hopefully I'll get some time to make a third video and we look at some cool churches and maybe the Alcazar as well. First thing I'm going to do is give a quick mention to the train station that awaits you on your arrival from Madrid. It was built in 1919 in a traditional local style, and to my mind it's very attractive. Toledo is well known for its production of steel weapons. You'll find them on sale everywhere. In a way, it's part of the architectural story of the town. The range of architecture to be found in Toledo has much to do with the town's rich history. It was a Roman settlement, it was the capital of the Visigoth kingdom. In the early 8th century it became part of Muslim Al-Andalus, and then after the Reconquest it was occasionally the location of the Spanish court. There are traces of all these cultural influences to be found everywhere, often in the same building. Added to that, the sun-bleached brick, the ochre-coloured plaster, and the various Baroque flourishes you'll find, they all make Toledo feel extremely southern, and yet the Gothic detailing and the tower designs you'll see all around you give you the feeling that you might be somewhere closer to the Baltic, and it's this sense of paradox, this strong sense of contrast that makes Toledo very striking. Toledo is a town that has a lot of different identities going on all at the same time. We'll start with the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes, which is to the west of the historic centre. It was begun in the 1470s, and it's in a late Spanish Gothic style with strong mudéjar influences, and we'll talk about mudéjar architecture a little bit later. It was built by Ferdinand and Isabella to commemorate their victory in a battle to consolidate power in the region, and it was given to the Franciscans. The chains you see on the facade are said to be the shackles which were worn by Christians held captive by Muslims. In a way, this detail sets a tone for the whole town. The monastery was very badly damaged during the Napoleonic occupation, after which time it fell into disuse for quite an extended period. The building we see today is substantially restored, but proof, I think, that it's better to restore than to leave a building to perish. When I first visited the monastery, you entered through this door here and immediately descended into this vaulted room. It was the most remarkable entrance to a monastery I'd experienced, but these days you enter down a less spectacular stairs, which is off to one side. Let's go immediately to the upper cloister. We go via these stairs, which curiously, in contrast to the rest of the building, are in a very classical style. What's interesting about this cloister is that while it's superficially in a Gothic style, we don't really have a sense of being in a Gothic space. There's a lot to be teased out on this point, but a lot of this has to do with the mudéjar influence we were talking about. Mudéjar work is associated with the builders, originally Muslim, who converted to Christianity after the Reconquest. This type of mudéjar style ceiling is called artisanado. These arches are not about expressing the transfer of the building load. In a way, their job is to disguise the fact that there is a load. In other words, it's doing the opposite of what we'd normally find in a Gothic structure, and we sense this when we're in the building. Much of the sculpture you see on the lower part of the cloister was done in the 20th century because the restoration work in the monastery continued at least until the 1960s. Before we enter the church proper, we'll have a look at this. This is one of the design drawings from the original construction, and it's by the draftsman architect Juan Guas, who also designed the Palacio del Infantado in Guadalajara, which isn't that far from Toledo. And although now it's modified, it's another of my favourite buildings. The drawing here is in the Prado Museum in Madrid, and it says a lot about the type of space Guas was attempting to make. This is not the crossing and altar of a typical Gothic church. This is an attempt to make a single unified space, which is much more akin to what was starting to happen in Italy around this time. And this is quite an interesting and maybe even challenging idea. This idea comes up again in the plan of the church. It's not like the more typical Gothic plans of the great French cathedrals with their side aisles and ambulatories. It feels much more like the plan arrangement of some of the Jesuit churches of over a century later. So this, for example, is Il Gesù in Rome from the 1560s. Now, this point is an important part of the architectural quality of the space, because the church has that Baroque feeling of being one space, while at the same time encapsulating the Gothic sense of the tall, illuminated hall. Much of the architectural experience of the building also has to do with the ethereal quality of light as it falls on the continuous surfaces of the interior, and I'd suggest that you go on a sunny morning to get the best effect. It's still used as a place of worship, which gives the visitor a feeling of authenticity you don't always get when you visit former religious structures that have now been turned into visitor centres. Just a short walk up the street, you'll find this very interesting little structure. It's now a museum, but it was originally a synagogue, and originally called the Ibn Shushan Synagogue, but it's now called Santa Maria la Blanca. That a synagogue would be called after the Virgin Mary gives an indication of how complicated the history of Toledo really is, and it also says much about the position of the Jewish population, not only in Toledo but also in the wider Spain. It was built around 1180, and it's said to be the oldest remaining synagogue in Europe. You enter through a very lovely and intimate little courtyard, but nothing in the courtyard suggests the space that awaits you ahead. Adding to the richness of the experience is the fact that the form suggests more a mosque than a synagogue. On plan, it comprises a series of 5 aisles, with each aisle defined by horseshoe arches on robust stone columns. The synagogue was taken away from the Jews and turned into a church, and this explains how it got its very curious name. In the course of time, the building ceased being used as a church, and it was put to a variety of community uses before finally being restored and made available to the public. And as I understand it, it was after a very recent restoration that the walls became this striking white. In the original, they would have been covered in various forms of art. This building is a genuine architectural experience and very well worth the visit. We're only taking a very short stroll to our next visit. It's another ancient synagogue with another Christian name. It's known as El Tránsito. El Tránsito is the Spanish term used to refer to the Assumption into heaven of the Virgin Mary, but it was originally known as the Samuel Halefi Ablafia Synagogue. It too is unassuming on the outside, but the interior couldn't be more different from the neighbour we just visited. It was built in the mid-14th century as a private place of worship for a wealthy Jewish family whose substantial house was located right next door. Now, this itself is quite intriguing, as it was difficult to construct synagogues in Spain or indeed most parts of Europe during this period. The architectural experience here is all about one room, a basic rectangle with a very high and very beautiful ceiling. The windows are located at a high level, which gives the light a curious, kind of dusky quality. The women's gallery is also located quite high up, and this gives the room a very lofty feel. After the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, the synagogue was used for a while as a church, and then after that, like its neighbour, it was put to a variety of uses before eventually becoming the Sephardic Museum, which it is today. This is a very small and very modest building, but the Mudéjar work is really beautiful and it's definitely well worth a visit. That's it for our first Toledo itinerary. In the next video, we'll have 2 more cool architectural buildings to look at. One is this tiny little mosque, and the other is the main event in Toledo, which is its amazing cathedral. I hope you'll join me.